Act 1. An ordinary girl, an unspeakable end. In the late 1980s, Japan was a nation at the peak of its economic power. Its cities were vibrant hubs of technology and pop culture, and life for many was defined by optimism and opportunity. In Misato, Saitama Prefecture, a city just outside the bustling metropolis of Tokyo, lived a 17-year-old high school student named Junko Furuta. By all accounts, she was a bright, cheerful, and well-liked girl. She had a part-time job, good friends, and dreams for her future after graduation. She was, in every sense, an ordinary girl living an ordinary life. But in the winter of 1988, her ordinary life was set to collide with an evil so extraordinary, it would leave a permanent scar on the consciousness of a nation. The date was November 25, 1988. After finishing her shift at her part-time job, Junko was riding her bicycle home, just as she did every other night. But this night was different. She was ambushed by a group of 4 teenage boys. The leader of the group was an 18-year-old named Hiroshi Miyano. He and his accomplices were not strangers to violence. They were low-level delinquents with connections to the Yakuza, Japan's notorious organized crime syndicate. They kidnapped Junko under a false pretense, and from that moment, her life ceased to be her own. They took her to a house in the Adachi district of Tokyo, a house owned by the parents of one of the perpetrators. For Junko, the door to this house was not an entry point. It was the closing of a world. It was the beginning of an ordeal that the Japanese media would later call the 44 Days of Hell. She would never see her family, her friends, or her home again. A vibrant young life, full of promise, had just been dragged into the darkest of shadows. Act 2. The House of Horrors. The house in Adachi was unremarkable from the outside. A typical Japanese suburban home on a quiet street. But inside its walls, it had become a private prison, a laboratory for unimaginable cruelty. This was possible for one primary reason: fear. The leader, Hiroshi Miyano, had bragged about his connections to the Yakuza. This connection, whether entirely true or exaggerated, was a powerful weapon. It created a shield of terror around the house. The house belonged to the parents of one of the kidnappers, a boy named Yasushi Watanabe. In one of the most chilling aspects of this case, Watanabe's parents were aware that a girl was being held captive in their home. They knew she was there against her will, but they were terrified of Miyano and his supposed Yakuza ties. They were afraid for their own safety and the safety of their son. And so, paralyzed by fear, they chose to do nothing. They became silent accomplices, their inaction allowing the horrors to continue unabated in the room upstairs. The 4 main perpetrators were Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Yasushi Watanabe, and Shinji Minato. They were not master criminals. They were high school-age delinquents, fueled by a toxic mix of arrogance, entitlement, and a profound lack of empathy. They saw Junko not as a human being, but as an object for their amusement and a receptacle for their rage. Over the 44 days, they would invite dozens of other friends and fellow gang members to the house. It is estimated that over 100 people knew of Junko's captivity. Yet, not a single person went to the police. The collective silence, born from fear, apathy, or a twisted sense of loyalty, allowed this house of horrors to remain undisturbed. Act 3, 44 Days of Hell, the timeline. To recount the day-by-day events of Junko Furuta's captivity would be to recite a litany of horrors that pushes the limits of human comprehension. The court documents and testimonies from the perpetrators detail acts of such extreme cruelty that they defy narration. For the sake of decency and to respect the memory of Junko, we will not provide a graphic list of the atrocities she endured. Instead, we will focus on the timeline to understand the psychological torment and the missed opportunities that defined her 44 days of hell. In the initial days, Junko's spirit was not broken. She pleaded with her captors, trying to reason with them. On one occasion, she managed to secretly dial the police emergency number. But her captors discovered her before she could speak, and the call was disconnected. For this act of defiance, she faced severe punishment. This moment marked a turning point, extinguishing one of the few glimmers of hope she had. Her family, meanwhile, was frantic. They had filed a missing persons report, but had no leads. Desperate, her parents received a phone call forced upon Junko by her captors. She was made to call home and tell her mother that she had run away with a friend and was safe, and that the police should stop looking for her. The call was meant to quell the investigation, and to a degree, it worked. It was another layer of psychological torment, forcing her to participate in her own disappearance. Perhaps the most haunting event occurred when the parents of the homeowner, Yasushi Watanabe, entered the room to speak with the boys. Junko was there, in plain sight, injured and terrified. Believing this was her chance, she begged them for help. But the parents, under the influence of Mayano's threats, ignored her pleas. They told her to be quiet and left the room. It is impossible to imagine the depth of despair she must have felt in that moment, when the only adults who could have saved her turned their backs and walked away. Day after day, the cycle of cruelty continued, each day bringing a new ordeal designed to break her body and her spirit. Yet, through it all, reports from some of the perpetrators later suggested that she maintained a level of dignity that unnerved them. Act 4. The Concrete Coffin. On January 4th, 1989, the 44th day of her captivity, Junko Furuta's ordeal came to an end. After a particularly brutal session of violence, her body finally gave out. She succumbed to her injuries, dying on the floor of the room that had been her prison for over a month. She was just 17 years old. For her captors, her death was not a moment of remorse, but an inconvenience. Their primary concern was not the life they had just extinguished, but how to dispose of the evidence. With cold calculation, they wrapped Junko's body in blankets and placed it inside a large, 55-gallon oil drum. They then drove to a construction supply store and bought several bags of cement. They took the drum to a desolate, reclaimed land area in Koto, Tokyo. There, they filled the drum with concrete, encasing Junko's body in a permanent, gray coffin. They pushed the heavy drum into the wet soil of the landfill, hoping it would sink and remain hidden forever. They had erased her from the world, and now they had buried the evidence in a tomb of concrete. They returned to their lives as if nothing had happened, confident their crime would never be discovered. Act 5. Justice and Outrage. For months, Junko Furuta remained a missing person, her fate unknown to her grieving family and the world. The secret of her murder was held by the perpetrators and the dozens of individuals who had known about her captivity. But such a dark secret could not stay buried forever. The break in the case came from an unexpected place. In the spring of 1989, police arrested Hiroshi Mayano and Joe Ogura for a separate, unrelated assault case. During the interrogation for that crime, the police detectives noticed something was off. They pressed Mayano, sensing he was hiding a much larger secret. Finally, under interrogation, Mayano confessed. He led the police to the landfill in Koto and pointed out the location of the oil drum. On March 29, 1989, police excavated the drum. Inside the hardened concrete, they found the remains of Junko Furuta. The discovery sent a shockwave across Japan. The story that unfolded in the subsequent investigation and trial horrified the nation. The details of the 44 days of torture, the number of people who knew and did nothing, and the sheer lack of humanity displayed by the teenage perpetrators were beyond anything the public had ever heard. The trial caused a second wave of public outrage. Because all four main perpetrators were minors at the time of the crime, under the age of 20, they were tried under Japan's juvenile law. This meant their identities were initially kept secret from the public, and they faced significantly lighter sentences than they would have as adults. Hiroshi Mayano, the leader, received a sentence of 20 years. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. For a crime of such monstrous proportions, the public felt the punishment was a profound injustice. The sentences sparked a nationwide debate about juvenile law, and whether it was adequate to handle such extreme cases of youthful violence. Act 6. A Scar on a Nation. The murder of Junko Furuta was more than just a crime. It was a national trauma. It forced Japanese society to confront uncomfortable truths about its youth, about collective responsibility, and about the nature of evil. The case became a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for the absolute worst of human behavior. It left a deep and lasting scar on the nation. In the years that followed, the case led to significant changes in Japan's juvenile justice system. The public outcry for harsher punishments for violent young offenders eventually led to legal reforms, lowering the age of criminal responsibility and allowing for more severe sentences in extreme cases. The perpetrators have since been released from prison. Some have attempted to live quiet lives, while others, like Joe Ogura, have reoffended and found themselves back in the legal system, showing little sign of remorse or rehabilitation. But the most important legacy of this case is the memory of Junko Furuta herself. It is crucial to remember that she was not just the subject of a horrific crime story. She was a person, a daughter, a friend, a student with a future that was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. Her story serves as a horrifying reminder of the consequences of apathy and the importance of speaking out against evil, no matter how intimidating it may seem. Her 44 days of hell ended, but the memory of her suffering and her resilience in the face of it must never be forgotten.